wrong, and it felt slightly strange today advertising this meeting, with everything's going on in the Middle East, etc. But why should we discuss something that happened 440 years ago, etc., which seems a bit abstract at the moment. But we are trying to show with this series that it's not abstract at all. That we need the working class to be organized on the highest level possible, politically and across borders, internationally, and that really is the only long-term solution to what we're witnessing at the moment. Oppression, colonization, racism, ethnic cleansing, and permanent war. We need to leave this current system behind. And how do we do this? How do we organize? How can we get into the position of challenging successfully? And it looks so far off at the moment, but I think we should take comfort in that, we have had in our history periods where things can change very quickly. And we've had people like Karl Marx, Engels, and their organizations who have tried to organize on the highest possible level. And we want to learn from them. We want to learn concretely, but also, it's a little bit abstract because it is 140 years ago, but we can learn from this very much. What can we learn concretely from the founders of scientific socialism and their involvement with the Social Democratic Party of Germany? This is what we're looking at today with Ben Lewis, who's an author, historian, writer, translator, a jack of all trades, and he's specializing in the Social Democratic Party of Germany. He's just brought out a book on Clara Zetkin, which is very good because I helped him edit it, and I can confirm it's very good. I'll put the link in the chat early on. And tonight he'll be looking at the Erfurt program, the minimum maximum program, and we'll get to that in the discussion some more as well, and the fusion formula. So that all sounds very exciting. Thank you very much for joining us, Ben. As usual, we have about 30-40 minutes for an introduction. And we'll bring in comrades from the floor for questions and debate.
Without being a pain, is it possible to share my screen? It doesn't matter if it's not.
Sorry. Let me just set that up.
Again, apologies to everyone for being late. I've never had that Zoom issue before where you just click and it won't let you join.
Okay, there you go. You should be able to do it now.
Okay, let's see. Share screen. There we go. And we're going to here. There we go. That should be clear, right?
Yes, very good.
Yep.
Just switch on the live stream if you get a message on the screen. Apologies.
Okay, no, that's all good. It won't upset me too much. Okay, so we're going to look today at the Erfurt program. I've just titled it "The Erfurt Program and Its Afterlives" because, as Tina kind of outlined at the start of the introduction, why look at this now? What is its relevance? Beyond that is what is the significance of the Erfurt program as handed down in history? What is our common understanding of it, and how does that reflect processes, ideological developments, debates within the workers' movement over the course of the last 130 years? Because obviously the experience of the Erfurt program, what it was at the time, etc., is not necessarily what we view it and see it as today. There's a whole historical transmission of 130 years in between. So just a few outline of what I'm going to do today. Some brief historical and theoretical background in 1891. So the Erfurt programs was agreed at the Erfurt Congress of the SPD in 1891. I look at the program. Tina mentioned the minimum maximum approach. I'll start with the maximum program, the theoretical section, so-called. And then the minimum program, the practical section, again, so-called. These terms can be slightly misleading, so we have to be careful, and we will be careful when we go through and unpack them. The significance of the Erfurt program, both at the time and historically. And then I want to look at some of the afterlives and how controversies surrounding the Erfurt program, whether we are consciously aware of it or not, feed into our political moment today, but also were significant within key developments within the workers' movement, ideological discussions within the development of the workers' movement at various junctures in history. And I start with Engels, his article he wrote on the Erfurt program in 1891. It was first published in 1901. I look briefly at Rosa Luxemburg and her discussion, a debate with Karl Kautsky in 1910, precisely over matters pertaining to the Erfurt program. And then I take a quick look at Kautsky and Lenin on the Erfurt program a bit later in 1917, to then finish with a broader look of historiography, i.e. what I started with at the beginning of the talk is how our understanding of what the Erfurt program is, even if we haven't even heard of it, what that reflects about what's happened in the intervening 130 years within our movement. Okay, apologies for the block of text, but I'm just going to kind of go through the points here. The first thing to be said, it shouldn't be confused with Die Linke's program from 2011. I think Die Linke thought, oh, this, when it was deciding its new program, oh, we'll use the anniversary of 1891, 120 years to decide a program, and yeah, it's certainly of a completely different characters. We'll see. But 1891 is significant in terms of German socialism because it reflects a key turning point in German history, where the anti-socialist laws, the banning of German socialism has come to an end, and we have a situation where a growing socialist movement is looking to assert itself, looking to give its party structures more definition, and to, as Kautsky puts it, provide theoretical reflection or programmatic reflection of the theoretical developments and gains it had made since the infamous, I suppose, Gotha program of 1875, which is what the Erfurt program replaces in 1891. And for Kautsky, for Engels, the significance of Erfurt in the first instance lies in the fact that the program is reflective of the kind of programmatic ideas that Marx and certainly Engels in the latter part of his life had been fighting for some time. I know you've looked at the Parti Ouvrier in this series so far, so I won't go into that. But essentially, the Erfurt program is a kind of German version of the Parti Ouvrier program of 1880, which was penned by Marx and Engels, but also is a product of a far less known program of Austrian social democracy called the Heinfeld program, which was passed in 1889, and they have a common structure, etc., which we'll look at. But essentially, the discussions at Erfurt, which result in a 7-day discussion in the city of Erfurt, in the Kaisersaal, in October 1891, there is a huge debate not only on the nature of the program and what it should do, etc., but also on the organizational aspects of the new party, which gets its name for the first time, the SPD. And that protocol is available. You can see the little picture of it there. Unfortunately, it's still the case that the speeches, the debates from that huge document of 7 days of discussion really have not been treated at all, but by scholars in any serious way. They haven't been translated, and that's reflective of something which we may come back to later on. But just to give that kind of outline, I think is important. What's also worth mentioning, and this is actually in my book, on which I'll link to later on Kautsky and republicanism, is that in that book, in the appendix, I have for the first time translations of all the various competing drafts of that program, right? So there's a particular period of gestation really lasting throughout the summer of 1891 in the run-up to the Congress in October, where we see various drafts along the way that are then presented to the Congress and decided upon within a commission and discussed and then presented for voting, where the new program is accepted unanimously. You have the party leadership draft in June, Engels's critique, which we'll come back to. Worth stressing that Engels's critique is directed against the draft of put forward by the party leadership in a letter to Kautsky, right? So we have to get the genesis here of this right, the chronology of it right. Because often Engels's critique is seen as a critique of the final program itself, which is not exactly true. You then have the leadership's official draft from July, so you can see how these things go along. They're in contact with each other, etc. You have Die Neue Zeitstrafe, which is penned by Kautsky. Then the Babelized so-called version of the Die Neue Zeitstrafe, And then all of this results then in the program itself. And in my book, I won't go into the details here, but you can see line by line every single difference within those drafts and how they come about, what they reflect about the nature of the program itself. And I suppose the key thing, aside from 7 days of discussion, is that this is something that had been planned for a long time and had been discussed in the party press, etc., which again hasn't been dealt with in any detail for some years. Indeed, in 1887, in the illegal Congress held in St. Gallen in Switzerland, already there we see a decision, a program commission established to say, okay, we need a new party program which reflects our new ideas, our move away from the kind of the salient traits that Marx lampooned in the critique of the Gotha program. And so this had been a process that lasted really for 3 or 4 years, but in the direct run up to the Congress lasted for across the 1891. The program was viewed as not to be a kind of list of the particular issues of the day, but to sketch the transition from capitalism to socialism. I've talked about how it became a model to be emulated. It came from the Heintel program, but also worth emphasizing that this was the kind of common sense across international socialism. And indeed, if you look at the program of the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democrats, you will find the exact same structure with a few differences, which we'll discuss, but very minor ones, actually, in terms of the structure, exactly the same. And we'll talk about the structure in a second. Kautsky's commentary on it, some of you may know this. It's got the snappy title of Das Erfurter Programm in seinem grundsätzlichen Teil erläutert in German. And obviously the translators thought, well, when I drop that, we'll just call it the class struggle. But it's again worth emphasizing that the class struggle is an abridged translation of his commentary on the document itself. It's not complete. And moreover, there was another pamphlet he produced with another author called Principles and Demands of Social Democracy, which again hasn't been translated into English, but gives context to this. Another point worth mentioning here very briefly is that this book and the role of Kautsky in this period that he played in the Erfurt program really sees him shoot to kind of international stardom as the kind of new kid on the block, in a sense, with Engels is getting older, but he's constantly in correspondence, etc., with Engels, as we shall see over these things. Tina mentioned at the start the minimum maximum program distinction, and it's worth stressing here that the Lasley makes this point very well in his What is to be Done in context. Minimum program is actually a slightly misleading term, in the sense that it implies kind of something minimal or not ambitious or not far-ranging, etc., in terms of its demands and its approach, and the opposite is the case. And indeed, there's a translation question here too, because in many of the documents of the time, the German language is often a lot more specific and kind of less lazy than the English language. We have in English have the term minimum, which can mean both something quite small and ambitious on the one hand, but also the very least that one would do or the one would ask for. Whereas in German, that distinction is clearer with the minimal, minimum, and mindest. And often in these things, you'll see terms of das Mindestprogramm. So the very least, it's a kind of esoteric translation point, but it gets across the idea that actually what is being outlined in the practical section that we'll come on to is the very minimum basis upon which the SPD would take power. And again, that's something I'm working on at the moment that will be out in the future. And I see I've got the French Workers' Party draft there. The language does change; it's complicated, but I just wanted to highlight that because often in terms of historiography, as we'll see, there's this impression that the maximum section, the theoretical section, and then the minimum section, the political demands, are somehow incongruent or in opposition or antagonism with each other, and that's incredibly misleading, because actually the guiding idea here, as you will have seen with the French Workers' Party program, is that basically the political demands in particular of the program represent, as I say, the minimum basis upon which the SPD, with majority support, would take power and enact that program. that is also synonymous with something that's been lost or subjected to certain distortion in Marxist historiography, which is the democratic republic. And I have a Marx and Engels quote here, and Engels obviously is important in this regard in terms of his critique of the Erfurt program. But essentially, the idea was that once these the framework in which these political demands will be achieved is what they call the democratic republic, or the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. We'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a second. I don't want to spend too much time on the actual program itself. You can see it. It's in translation. As I said, there's a slightly updated translation in my book, which is available. But again, the basic structure is, and again, it's taken from the Parti Ouvrier and the Heinfeld program, that you have the first section, which basically outlines the course of economic development, what that means, what it entails for the workers' movement, what the developmental tendencies of capitalism are, why the party is a socialist party, what that means, and how that distinguishes it from other parties. Kautsky in a commentary not on this program, but actually the Heinfeld program of the revised Heinfeld program of 1902, something I'm translating at the moment for my Patreon. He makes the very good point that without this section, without the maximum section of the party, social democracy is unable to distinguish itself fundamentally from other parties, including bourgeois parties, right? Because they also want certain reforms, they want to achieve certain things, but Kautsky says it's the maximum program that fundamentally is what's required both for the unity of the organization, both for keeping it coherent and not running itself into the ground, but also that ties the final goal, in the sense that ties the party together and as I say, marks it out from the other parties. A lot has been said about the Erfurt program, some nonsense that it's somehow kind of, I don't know, aloof to the idea of the working class taking power or revolution, etc. And you'll read a lot of that on the left more generally. But I've just picked out some points here that make clear that that's clearly not the case. If you look at the document, as much as it can be criticized, it can't be criticized for that, I would say. And again, here, just a list of some of the main then immediate or minimum demands as they are proceeding on the basis of these principles. I've just highlighted a few that are worth looking at. Suffrage, proportional representation, abolition of prejudice or things that place, or laws that place women at a disadvantage compared with men. That's incredibly important, because with this move in the early 1890s, the SPD was the first party in German Kaiserreich to advocate the full emancipation of women, and actually was laughed at for that in parliamentary debates and discussions, which is just worth kind of keeping in mind when we look back on these things and what we can be proud of, certainly in our movement. Free expression of opinion, the secularization of schools, judges elected by the people, abolition of indirect taxes and customs, with customs being a big issue in the German Kaiserreich eventually, that caused huge inflation, a policy dictated by the Junker class to keep their profits high. The other thing that's key in point 3, and again, you'll find this in all the social democratic programs of the time, is the education of all to bear arms, and the militia in the place of the standing army. That was just kind of ABC of this movement, including actually by some on the right who were uneasy with aspects of the Erfurt program, particularly its more maximal section. So I've talked slightly about the significance. You can see that's my book up there. That's the expensive version. There is a cheaper paperback version that you can get now, probably quite cheaply. It came out a few years ago with the drafts, etc. It's worth looking at. I do hope at some point to return to this question and to also translate quite a lot of the discussion, because it's important and it gives a really kind of nice insight into how what the party was thinking, what the discussion points were, etc. We should probably come on to the Engels in a second, and Engels's critique. because it's funny that as I said, that the Erfurt program has quite a bad rap due to historical factors that we'll hopefully be able to touch upon in this discussion. And even in this is my fault, by the way, not Tina's fault. Even in the reading, the introductory reading, I didn't send anything through in time or whatever. And both of them are critiques. There's Lenin's State and Revolution, section 4.1, I think it is, which I reread this week, and there's also Engels's critique. Now we know that we should know, hopefully after this, what I've said, that Engels's critique is aimed at the party leadership's first draft in a private letter to Kautsky, which is only published 10 years later in 1901. Kautsky had particular motives for that, i.e. the struggle against the revisionist right, as kind of using Engels as an authority figure in that sense to fight against Bernstein and others. And Engels's critique is really worth looking at in some detail, not only for its insight into the program, but also because it's later used by two key figures in the left of our movement, i.e. Rosa Luxemburg in 1910 and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in 1917 in State and Revolution, as I've just outlined. And what's forgotten, I think, in this whole discussion is that if you read, and probably some of you have gone away and read the Engels thing because it was reading for today, Engels is actually rather pleased for reasons that make sense given what I've just said. This program, the way it's been put together, is viewed rightly as the victory of Marxist ideas over Lassalleanism, and so on and so forth. The structure clearly follows what Engels has been pursuing and advocating for within the movement more broadly. And Engels is a key figure in the latter years of his life. He's working on Marx's manuscripts, but he's also directly intervening in a lot of the debates in the German-speaking parties in particular. But Engels, essentially, his main critique is that he says it lacks precisely what should have been said, i.e. it does not call for what I referred to earlier on explicitly for the democratic republic as a kind of culmination of all of the demands. So he says, the demands are great, but they lack the one thing. They don't actually point out the goal, the aim, which is the culmination of those demands. And that's a problem. He then says, okay, I do understand why this might be the case. Why? Well, again, the context is the party has only recently emerged out of illegality. So it was banned for 12 years. You still have in the 1890s moves by some of the German conservatives to reenact the ban or to produce a new one. You have throughout this period, actually, which we often overlook, Andrew Bonnell's book gets this across really well. You have editors of newspapers, in particular social democratic newspapers, and there were hundreds of them, local newspapers, being taken to court and jailed for treason, for some of the ideas that they're saying about the state and changing it fundamentally, etc. So the context has to be in mind. And Engels says, well, look, maybe we can find another way of approaching this question, or putting it as something like, the concentration of power in the hands of the people, or something like that, right? We can find an alternative way. But it is worth stressing that that's the bone of contention here. And many people then take from that a kind of original sin within the Erfurt program. They contrast it, for example, with the Russian Social Democrats, who had the Democratic Republic and indeed the dictatorship of the proletariat in the program. That was one difference. And they sometimes then account for the differing courses of these parties with reference to this. Now, I think that's oversimplistic, but I do nonetheless agree, and we'll come on to that in the context of Rosa Luxemburg in a second, that Engels's comments are indeed insightful, because he does warn even at that point that if we soft pedal the question of the Democratic Republic, it does kind of give oxygen to the development of what he calls honest opportunism, and kind of almost implies that, even though the demands don't, but the absence of the clear aim kind of gives room for maneuver for the old Lassallean ideas of the free people's state, etc., the state playing some kind of the existing state structure playing some kind of benevolent role in terms of cooperatives, etc. So that is really the main bone of contention, and I think we'll come back to that in a second. I've still got some time, so that's good. The other thing that I wanted Tina had in the title, the merger formula and the merger of socialism and the workers' movement. I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but I will flag up some issues, because it's the question of socialist consciousness emerges here in a strange way. Again, the article I'm working on at the moment, the translation I'm working on at the moment, is one from 1902, where Kautsky is discussing a revision of the of Austrian social democracy's Heinfeld program and the reasons behind that. And one of the things that he says and is picked up by Lenin, actually, when he's writing What Is to Be Done, it's almost as if he's kind of reaching for a quote to substantiate some of the claims he's making in Russia, and he just happens to grab the latest issue of Die Neue Zeit and says, oh yeah, Kautsky, there we go, and he quotes Kautsky. It's about socialist consciousness as being brought from the outside, as etwas von außen hineingetragenes, and the whole question of that has raised a whole number of issues about in his historiography about elitist Leninism, elitist Marxism, etc., etc. But really, the opposite is the case, and again, the key study here is Lars Lee's What Is to Be Done, and basically this is just making the point that the program of socialism, scientific socialism in that sense, is not something that necessarily arises spontaneously within society, but is the product of the accumulated knowledge of various people, many of whom happen to be from outside the workers' movement directly, as we know, Marx, Engels, Kautsky, etc. But we're active within it, clearly. So that's just worth flagging up as well. It's just this weird history of this, where the commentary on one program ends up and has this strange long history that lives with us to today. Taking a step back now, so we go back to Engels's critique on the Republic and the absence of the clear demand for a democratic republic. This is something, and I've written on this, and there's videos online I'm sure I can link to. This is something that is picked up in 1910 by Rosa Luxemburg in her argument with Karl Kautsky. Now, I don't have time to go into the discussions about that. Again, I've done videos on it, 1910 and all that is the YouTube talk I gave on it. And she is convinced that at a time when the monarchy is becoming an increasingly important factor, the kind of personal regime of the Kaiser and how he has his kind of tentacles in all of the reactionary aspects of the Kaiser state, from militarism, navalism, the Junker class, the police, etc., etc. She makes the point that, well, look, we need to be raising the question of the Republic, because we have an undemocratic three-tier suffrage system in Prussia, which is the cause of these mobilizations and discussions within the SPD that follow. And she says, well, look, what has happened to the question of the Republic? Where is that gone? And what happened is quite revealing in terms of the development of, or the decline, in a sense, of Karl Kautsky as a theoretician, because I've got the quote here, and this is in my book. He says that in 1905, clearly along the lines of Engels's critique about in terms of democracy and republicanism, he says, we're Republicans for the very reason that the democratic republic is the only political form which corresponds to socialism. That's exactly what Engels says. The monarchy can only exist on the basis of class differences and antagonisms. The abolition of classes also requires the abolition of the monarchy. By 1910, however, in the context of these huge demonstrations in Prussia and beyond for democracy in Germany, he says that it's true that our program does not explicitly mention the Republic, but there's no doubt that one cannot be a good social democrat if one is not a good Republican. We can have different opinions about the most appropriate way to express our Republican point of view. But precisely because Republican propaganda encounters so many obstacles in Germany, we must all the more carefully avoid anything that might awaken in the masses the belief that we have abandoned our Republican convictions, or even that we expect the monarchy to promote proletarian aims. Now, you can see, and look, this is what Luxemburg points out in her critique, that there's a distinct softening here on the question of republicanism, and Luxemburg is pressing for the slogan of the Republic to become kind of front and center of the party's agitation in this period. And she makes the point that essentially the party has not made systematic Republican propaganda for a very long time. And indeed, that's how she accounts for some social democrats going and kneeling before the king of Württemberg in Baden, and that's a whole other story which I've talked about. But essentially, she says that the malaise in our party with the right wing of reformists is essentially partly due to the fact that we have not taken republicanism and Republican agitation seriously. In the course of that discussion, which I'm also translating at the moment, Kautsky actually says, look, I wrote about the Republic elsewhere. I've dealt with this question before. It's not as if I've ignored it. And Luxemburg says, well, my memory fails me. I can't remember what he's referring to here. And what he's referring to are the texts that are in my book from 1905 that I translated into a book. So it's not that, as I've just shown, it's in 1905. It's not the case that Kautsky somehow hasn't understood Engels's critique or taken it on board or has a different message. He does. But you can see over the course of time, and this is something Luxemburg picks up on, that republicanism becomes i.e. the very point of the minimum program, the culmination of demands, is kind of soft pedaled over time. And she even quotes Marx, etc., in his comments on the Gotha program on here. Interesting too, in relation to this 1905 series of articles that Kautsky made on the minimum program and the necessity of Republican agitation, is that Lenin in State and Revolution, in a text that was very quickly put together against the backdrop of very fast-moving debates, very fast-moving events with very little material at its disposal. Lenin makes the point that social democracy never developed a theory of the state or republicanism, etc. And there is certainly a truth to that, but he also kind of forgot that series, despite having Die Neue Zeit constantly at his hand. 12 years later, like Luxemburg, he'd also forgotten about that series of articles by Kautsky, which I argue, for their fault, they do have faults, but they do nonetheless develop and build upon some of the points that Engels makes about the necessity of, or the nature of, the minimum program and how it operates. And just to show really how far Kautsky fell by 1927, he's basically saying in his book Historical Materialism that class struggle is no longer the motor of social development. So you see that kind of fall from somebody who in the early 1890s was the main thinker, the main popularizer of the ideas of class struggle and the program of social democracy, to somebody who moved away from that. Now, it's worth, I think, just to conclude, it's worth just briefly looking at some of the the reception of the Erfurt program. I've talked about how I've kind of touched upon at several occasions how it's been received, etc. But I would say that even to this day, and hopefully this will be something that's in the discussion, it is a program that is largely maligned and misunderstood. And it's often held as responsible for the betrayal of 1914 by German social democracy, which I think is simplistic, as I've pointed out, albeit very briefly. And I would indeed argue that the background, the motives, the debates, and the ideas behind it really are an important point of reference for the left today in trying to rediscover its past following a century of defeat, but also in trying to organize on the kind of level, and indeed more than the level, that the SPD was able to do in terms of mass socialist common sense amongst a huge section of the working class and the population more broadly, seen through a negative lens. It's also worth mentioning that in terms of the official communist or many of us in the far left who've had our kind of history from an organizing on the far left, there's a tendency to junk the Erfurt program and to put it into kind of the dustbin of history, in the sense that it's either not treated at all or done so in a negative way. So the classic text here in terms of party history and distortion of socialist history is Stalin's Short Course, which I think was one of the best-selling books of socialism in the 20th century. And he doesn't mention the Erfurt program at all, in contrast to Lenin, and many of the Bolsheviks at the time who praised the Erfurt program, who openly say we want to emulate the Erfurt program. That's what they do in the early 1900s, as I pointed out. Again, this kind of Stalinist attempt to create this gulf between, revolutionary Bolshevism and fuddy-duddy reformist German socialism, which is problematic to say the least. GDR historiography, which I know a fair bit about, essentially is a bit more nuanced. So it actually mentions the Erfurt program and it says, look at some of the great things it did. It'll cite Engels, of course, but it'll say, look, it had its place in a so-called period of a peaceful capitalist development, which is a criticism you'll also hear often among anti-Stalinist leftists such as Trotskyists. You also get this sense and I alluded to this earlier on, this relationship between the ultimate aim of socialism, the minimum demands in the here and now, and the bridge to that being the culmination of those demands in the form of the democratic republic that opens up that space, opens up that transition to socialism on an international scale. In the discussions of the Western historiography, it's often said that they say these things do not fit together at all. And what's worse is because it ended up being the case that the theoretical part was largely written by Kautsky with some edits, and the practical demands were largely written by Bernstein with some edits by Babel, etc. That then many historians say, well, you see, that's the classic thing, because Bernstein was the revisionist reformist. Well, he wasn't in 1891, by the way. And Kautsky was this theoretical, socialism will come, it's inevitable. And, never the twain shall meet, essentially. And that was the whole history of social democracy in their idea. So they even say, look, it was only in 1959 and this is SPD historians, it was only in 1959 in Bad Godesberg, just outside Bonn, when the SPD finally ditched Marxism. It'd done it to all intents and purposes a long time ago, but it actually removed it completely from its program too. That kind of dilemma between these two things was resolved. And indeed, you get the ideas of attentism and fatalism, which I've dealt with again in other places, but I'm happy to take questions on that. And yeah, I think that's probably where I should end here. Just to say that when it comes to Luxembourg, she again, I've written about this in an article, Rosa and the Republic, where she draws looking at the defeat of social democracy and its betrayal within the German Revolution. She draws the conclusion that past actually needs to be completely junked, which many others do. Lenin at the same time didn't, which doesn't make him right, of course, but I think it's worth mentioning that and seeing how these different positions lined up. And I do think that this is a part of our history that shouldn't be junked, but in order to gain or glean as much as we can from it, necessitates that we actually begin to understand it on its own terms. And that's some of the problem. That's perhaps the main obstacle when it comes to the question of the Erfurt program and where it is and how we view it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Excellent opening. Could you stop sharing screen, please? I mean, there's a lots of questions and issues that you've touched on and that, the Erfurt program touches on. Comrades, if you have a question, I would like to make a commentary, please click raise hand under reactions. I'm going to start off asking you a couple of things. The merger formula is interesting, and Lars Thiele, as you say, has written a whole book almost exclusively around that to oppose the idea that there's the Marxists believe that only they have basically, there's this idea, the workers' movement can go so far. They will fight for higher wages, they will fight for better working conditions, etc. But the idea that socialism, the idea that you have to fight for scientific socialism, not other kinds of socialism, etc., has to be brought from the outside, can be viewed as, you have your theoreticians, you have your leaders of the SWP, etc. They know it all, and they just announce it in the newspaper once a week. They tell their people what it is, etc. And that's how it's often seen, as that is the sort of elitist kind of view. But as you said, you believe that it just meant it doesn't arise spontaneously. That you have to have some kind of bridge, you have to have some kind of understanding. The idea of socialism, are you saying, cannot arise spontaneously, but it doesn't have to be brought in, it has to be worked out, doesn't it? It is a scientific method, it has to be worked out in the sense outside your economic struggle, in that sense, because that will only take you so far. And that goes back to this debate. Can you speak about this a little bit more, perhaps?
No, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated question, and it's one of these things, as I said, where somebody gets it's literally, if you go to what is to be done, you can see that Lenin is he's making a few points about the economists, etc., and he's trying to score some points there, and he's making the point that fundamentally what we need, if the working class is truly to advance, is we need a clear political program and we need a political organization. Now, that is not something that will necessarily arise from the economic struggle as it was in Russia at that time, right? So that's the core point that he's making at the time. And it's just funny to me that in order to kind of buttress that, he just reaches to a shelf behind him, picks up this weird commentary by Kautsky on the revision of the Austrian Social Democrats program to underline that point. Now, I'm not saying that then necessarily means that it's impossible for people within the sphere of any particular economic struggle or whatever to arrive at socialist ideas, but the point would be that there are structures, there are ideas, there are traditions there that exist for us today that we would be silly to neglect or to ignore. In that sense, it's quite clearly the opposite of what I do, right? I'm trying to look at where things have gone wrong, how ideas have changed and transformed, how things have been distorted and lost, etc., literally lost in translation at some time. But yeah, so that's the kind of the point, I think, because this is about party building and strategy, etc., etc. And I think that's a point that's worth hammering home.
You agree though with this idea that that's the idea of socialism? A lot of people think it's socialism, and Jeremy Corbyn seems to think that is being nice to each other. If we all just sort of love each other more, etc., that's the way to socialism. It's not, though, is it?
No, I think so. Again, it's hard to draw obvious parallels with these things, but that just strikes me as kind of more of the utopian stuff that the Marx and Engels are criticizing. It obviously has a certain place. It's a product of certain historical constellations in the 20th century. The experience of socialism as being, not particularly nice and lovey-dovey and all the rest of it. But yes, the question would be, and it's a more complicated one from our perspective today, in a sense, is that, where are we? Right. That's what you start with. You don't start with, oh, there's a big strike in X part of Russia or of Germany, right? Or there's a war here or something. What you start with is, where are we in terms of human history, as much as we can understand that? What is the nature of the system we live under, i.e. capitalism? How is that developing? How do we foresee it developing? And what does that mean for the organization of those that we think, on the basis of some understanding both of the society itself and the working class as the agent of revolutionary change? How do we start going about that, right? And I think that's the kind of main point here that's being made. But it had a whole history, as I say, with people picking up on it as kind of this reflective of elitist Marxism, not trusting the workers, etc., having to lead them by the nose and spoon feed them and all the rest of it. That's not what it's about. It's about providing if anything, it's the opposite. It's a confidence in the ability of workers with the correct ideas and structures to assimilate this stuff and take it on and take it all within all sorts of places. That's the point. And
learning from our history, taking collective knowledge as well, isn't it? Learning as a class and not just as individuals. Just on the question then, I mean, we're making a big thing here about minimum maximum program, and this is obviously what Marx and Engels were arguing for, and yet today you see a lot of Marxists, socialists arguing against the minimum maximum program, and instead for a transitional program, not always on a theoretical level. It's just that's what clearly is needed because Trotsky said so. Where do you see the main differences between a transitional and minimum maximum approach? And not just historically, but also today, if there's a difference.
Well, I think the point is kind of half made in my last response, is that where do you start? What is your point of departure? Now, the transitional program has its own particular history. What I can say here in terms of the move away from that is something I referred to, and again, I've written an article on this from the debates in the Russian Social Democrats and the Bolsheviks in 1919. And again, I can recommend that in the chat later on, where I look at this in detail. And I mentioned how Luxembourg, for example, because Luxembourg thinks that essentially the epoch of the minimum maximum program is over. We need something new. We need to get rid of the minimum program, she says. So the immediate task now in Germany and indeed elsewhere is socialism. That's the immediate question on the agenda, which I think was wrong at the time, and I think it's still wrong now, right? You have to have the framework within which the working class can come to power, and that wasn't on the cards in 1919. You still needed the kind of constitutional basis that the Erfurt program kind of outlined, right? So there is a tendency then in 1918 to draw particular historical conclusions from the experience, the failure of social democracy. Bukharin and his supporters in the journal Communists make very similar points actually at the same time. And again, if you look at the debates there, Lenin is saying, well, look, we've got state power in Russia, but we still need the minimum program because we actually might lose state power, right? And we still need that framework. So these are discussions that go on. The whole transitional program and debates, etc., that's a much bigger topic. But in terms of method, I would argue that fundamentally what Trotsky was trying to do in terms of his time and his efforts were trying to say, well, look, we've got some kind of structures here. There is an organized working class. There are mass trade unions. There are mass parties in most places. The issue is leadership as opposed to consciousness. So with the right leadership based around the existing questions that are unfolding, that leadership can be changed and will take in the thing. Now, I think there are merits to that. I think it was wrong at the time, but clearly now in the context that we're working, it's about rebuilding something qualitatively different. And I think there are lessons to be taken from a time where in the 1880s, 1890s, the working class is consolidating itself into viable mass organizations, right? And that obviously comes with a lot of baggage. There are negative examples, there are problems, etc. But I think it's a better point of departure in that sense, right?
A couple of sentences. What then is the maximum program?
So the maximum program is essentially, if you read these programs, it's a couple of paragraphs basically on saying we are for the socialization of the means of production. We are for the liberation of humanity without distinction of sex, race, nationality. I think it says, that we are for communism, right? We are for a communist society. And what Kautsky makes the point that if you don't have that, and this is what Bernstein was constantly trying to get at, right? He's saying, well, look, it's all these kind of mad ideas of the future, etc. They're getting in the way of doing our compromises with certain parties to achieve certain reforms, right? And Kautsky makes the point, a very strong point. And again, I'll have this article translated soon, this weird article that Lenin picks up in 1902. It's a very good article because he says that, that without the maximum program, we're a left-wing party of social reform. So again, these debates echo through to today because there are many people who, often in good conscience will say, look, let's forget all the high ideas of, liberating humanity and all this kind of stuff. Just focus on getting the work done, the nitty gritty. And that's what is what will achieve positive results as opposed to just being in an opposition and et cetera, et cetera. And Luxembourg makes as critical as I am of her in terms of the conclusions she draws in 1919, she makes the excellent point in the 1910 discussions that she says, it's not only the maximum program that has kind of been relegated to what she calls Sunday speeches and things. It's also key tenets of the minimum program. So things like the republic, things like dissolving the army, dissolving the standing army for the people's militia. These are things that are seen as a bit too kind of left field and crazy. They're also relegated. And what she says quite rightly is that once you start to take away these key features of the program, you essentially become, knowingly or not, the kind of party that the SPD became in 1918-19, where it still was a radical left-wing party, but it presided over a bourgeois state, right, and a bourgeois army and a bourgeois police force, etc., etc. So I think that's those are the kind of things I would say that echo through to today.
And so the maximum program is the sort of compass, isn't it, that keeps you.
Yeah.
This is where we want to go. This is the direction. We might do this and this in the meantime, and we might swing left or right, but this is where we're going, which if you don't have it, yes, you can get lost. One last thing I was going to pick you up on, or actually the Engels, when in his article, his critique's quite interesting. As you say, it's a draft, etc. But you mentioned that in passing is this idea of the old society may develop peacefully into the new one. And this is something that I've had loads of discussions, and I'm sure you have too, with some of our Trotskyist friends in particular, who think this is absolute nonsense, that you could ever, the revolution must be, and there can't be any democracy. It has to be violent. It has to be lawless. I've heard a few times. It has to be without any rules, etc. The revolution will be, mayhem, etc. And that's what needed to take over. And here you have Engels, closest collaborator of Marx. This is a funny paragraph. Of course, I'll paraphrase it. Just really, he says in Germany you can't have that. You couldn't have a peaceful road because you have monarchy, etc. But he says one conceives that the old society may develop peacefully into the new one in countries where the representatives of the people concentrate all power in their hands, where, if one has the support of the majority of the people, one can do as one sees fit in a constitutional way in democratic republics like France and the USA. In monarchies such as Britain, where the immediate abdication of the dynasty in return for financial compensation is discussed in the press daily, and where this dynasty is powerless against the people. Now, this is obviously things change, etc. But it is an interesting idea that also the Chartists, of course, developed when they had their slogan was, peacefully if we can, forcefully if we must. But this is denied by many Marxists, isn't it? That anything like that could ever be possible. How would it be possible in your view, if it would be possible?
I think Engels is wrong, though. I think so. So the point is that what's good about this stuff is that you see that that Engels is thinking creatively, right? There's not just a kind of this ready-made schema. There are differences between absolutist Germany and Britain and Republican France, etc. But then if you read his writings, for example, on the French Third Republic, he basically says, this is the empire without the emperor, right? So even in republics, there needs to be a fundamental overhaul of the constitution and changing it and creating something new. You could even say, especially in republics, right? Because there is this view, and this is the whole basis of my Kautsky book, is Kautsky's arguments with French socialists that say basically we've essentially got socialism. We just need to kind of now form the government and we're done. Do you know what I mean? And I think Kautsky's very strong on that and saying, no, that's what he calls Republican superstition, and including American socialists. So I think there's creative thinking, and not, he talks about the Federal Republic, which I think is also important in the British context, and so on. But I think some of the ideas of the constitutional coming to power are problematic, which does not mean to say, however, that a relatively peaceful transition or revolution is off the cards. So I think that's a different conclusion altogether, right? But what it is, I think, what needs to be stressed more is that it needs a fundamental break with the existing state apparatus, and that requires force. I mean, Engels says against the anarchists, doesn't he? Can you imagine an act that's more authoritarian than a revolution, right? You can't. It's one section of society imposing its will on another. But how the concrete form that takes and how that pertains to and reflects existing political institutions is a different question. And the whole Engels peaceful thing was also a big bone of contention in the SPD subsequently, and even by the Euro communists in Britain, actually, in the 80s. So you see how these things filter through.
But I mean, if you're talking relatively peaceful, you can, if the working class builds up its own forces, I mean, the more prepared we are, if we have our own army, etc., our own militia, etc., if we are better prepared than them, etc., who knows how violent it has to get, etc. But yes, we take this Erfurt critique with a pinch of salt. We've got a few people with their hands up now. Just indicate when you want to come in, if you need a rest or whatever, but it works normally best if we have one question, one answer. I'm going to ask Steve Freeman first. It's right up your street, isn't it, Steve?
It's right up my garden path or something like that, Tina. Couldn't have wished for anything better. Well done, Ben. You've nailed it on the head, I think, with that. So what else can I say apart from can repeat? I will make a couple of points. So just for emphasis, not because you haven't really covered them, but I just think they need to be sort of taken a bit. I mean, I've been arguing up to this point that we should use the term Republican communist rather than narco-communist. By Republican communist, I mean that's a recognition that the democratic republic is central to a Republican communist. Whereas if you're an anarcho-communist or even a kind of ultra-left, then you tend to think, oh, let's blow up the state, let's just abolish the state immediately. Whereas we as Republican communists think we are going through a process of winning state power through a republic. And the term Republican communist then makes it clear that the minimum program is really the Republican program in the way that you've just illustrated for us, and the maximum program is the communist program. So that term Republican communist, I think, captures that very, very neatly. And the problem, if you just use the term, and of course, these two parts, republicanism and communism, they form a whole. But I think you could argue that the Republican bit is actually transitional. I mean, you can call it minimum, but in a way, it's also transitional, because the idea of it is you can fight for real reforms, that you can mobilize the masses of people to win those reforms. Because in actual fact, in the program that you showed us, most of those things are in people's consciousness anyway. They're not completely outlandish. They're all things that people in our society think, oh, that's reasonable. They're things that people can win and can be won, but it takes you to somewhere else. It takes you to a position where the working class can take power. And in that sense, the minimum is also transition with a small t. I mean, I don't mean in the Trotsky's way transitional. So I think if you call it the Republican program, then I think you get away from this. Does minimal mean minimal? Does it mean minimum, etc.? And it's important to emphasize that a Republican program is not simply a single issue thing. It's not about like abolishing the king. You don't need to have a king to have a Republican program, as you've already emphasized. The full program is just as applicable if you're in a presidential republic, as you said, in the case of America or France today. So you can still have a Republican program even in a republic. And the thing about the Corbyn program, because that's where we need the critique of the Corbyn program. The Corbyn program, you could think was a minimal program. You could think that it was a set of concrete reforms that could be won in the 217, 219 Labour manifestos, which the left is still in England, is still enthused about that. But it's really a reform within the confines of a constitutional monarchy. And so I think what you said about Rosa Luxemburg is very relevant, actually, because she said they'd done, I think you said bugger all, did you say? They'd done bugger all about it. And I think you could say, well, the English left, they've done bugger all about republicanism, and therefore they will always inevitably be useless in terms of actually taking it forward. And I think you can say, and I'll finish on this, because we're using that phrase about how consciousness comes to the working class, that we were discussing before. And you could apply that to the Republican program as well. And you say, does the working class naturally, automatically, spontaneously, by going on strike, become recognize the need for a Republican program? And I think there's a two-part answer. I think that working class people understand republicanism a lot better than most people imagine. They don't really need us to tell them anything much about that. You can sort of see that in the whole way in which workers struggle for sovereignty and democracy and all these things. It's kind of natural. And yet at the same time, the other point is also true. You have to have a scientific understanding of republicanism, about the party, the tactics, which doesn't come spontaneously from people going on strike. You know, and if you want to know good tactics, Republican tactics, you've got to read something like Lenin's Two Tactics, which is a very sophisticated argument. Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Republic, or the Democratic Revolution, I think it's the proper title to it. And that is about Republican tactics. And there's no way those tactics arrive naturally and spontaneously in the workplace. They come from the scientific study of the history of the working class. So I'll finish there.
Yep. Well put. Thank you, Steve. Ben, before I bring you in, shall I ask the question by Bill, which is in the Q&A?
Yeah, I just wrote to him. I've read it. So yeah, do you want to read it? It's quite long, but it's about the role of Wilhelm Liebknecht.
Yeah, if you could sum it up, perhaps that'd
yeah. So Bill makes two good points. So one is a correction. I said that the letter to from Engels was to Kautsky, was addressed to Kautsky, and then dug up in 1901 as a kind of hammer to hit the revisionists, which is not entirely true, because he, as Bill's pointed out, this is it was actually addressed to Liebknecht. Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the two main leaders really in the German socialist movement, who died, and then the letter itself was found, so they published it, and I think that's an important correction. Thank you for that. So he goes into a little bit, and this is something I haven't looked at for a while in terms of the draft. So Liebknecht was involved in this process as well, and he says, is there a reason why that Liebknecht was kind of unhappy with the way things panned out, right? Was it just a personal thing? So he says the SPD's party executives draft, i.e. the first one that was then developed and worked upon by several people, was largely written by Liebknecht, which I think is right. And then it was kind of junked in favor of Die Neue Zeitung with Bebel's input. So Bebel would have been on the party executive as well, but in the end chose to kind of Babelize Kautsky's draft and go from there. And he talks about what are the possible reasons for that, and he points out that the usual stuff you find in historiography is not very helpful, i.e. kind of the determinist Kautsky versus the voluntarist Liebknecht. All I would say on that is I don't think it's personal per se, but I do remember reading a while back in a book on Engels and the Erfurt program, which I need to find the reference written. I'll send it to you. That basically that Liebknecht himself was actually closer to a lot of the Lassallean ideas on this question. Whether you can put that as a question of voluntarism and determinism, that seems slightly simplistic to me and reflective of the usual literature on this stuff. But it seems to me that there were political differences. But as you probably know, I think you mentioned it. Yeah, in the end, he was kind of rolled out as somebody. He was the person that essentially opened the Erfurt Congress, if I remember correctly, defending the new program. So he was kind of sent out to be a kind of authority behind it, even though there were some objections there and history in terms of he wasn't absolutely happy with it. But I need to dig up that reference again, and thank you for pointing that out, because it's a good point. Again, the genesis behind this whole thing, like I said, I put together the drafts, but trying to see exactly who was saying what and why is important, and as I said, reflects underlines the point that I made in terms of we have this protocol, this record of 7 days of discussions at Erfurt about not only the program, but about the party statutes, about legality and structures that really it hasn't been touched. And I say I haven't looked at it, in any detail for a while, but I think it needs to be more widespread. So thank you, Bill.
Also interesting, isn't it? 7 days of just discussion, and months before that, discussions and debates, etc., and changes. I mean, today usually you get it, here's the founding conference, here it is. You're not allowed to make any great amendments, etc. So did they have these discussions open in the party press, or was it so normal members as well could get involved and follow all of that?
I'm not sure about normal members in the sense of, there would be a particular structure for submitting articles. And as far as I know, that in terms of submissions, it would largely depend on, it would mainly be journalists, party journalists and stuff that are writing in the paper. But also you have to realize as well that you have these 4 main drafts that are prepared in a commission, but there are then also the Anträge, the motions to the F. So there are local party regions then feeding off it, and generally I would say I'm actually working on something else at the moment from 1905. So I'm looking at the Jena Congress, where they completely, so Bill's right, there was a program commission of 25 people, and I think, as far as I remember, if I remember rightly, that program commission was agreed, or the commission was set in 1887 actually. So it's not as this kind of this bottom-up process. It was, and again, you have to remember that in the anti-socialist laws, the party the party deputies in the Reichstag, they had quite a lot of power because they were legal, right? They could actually speak and organize, etc., whereas the party members couldn't. So it was a top-down process in that sense. And I think 25 people agreed upon, decided 3 or 4 years earlier, right? But yes, in the run-up to the Congress, there were articles in the paper, in the various papers, but also the motions, which again I have to go away and look at. It's kind of tiny, old Gothic German writing, hundreds and hundreds of pages of somebody just very faithfully keeping a stenographic record of all of the things, which is an amazing resource. And the fact that these things have been neglected for so long is criminal, really.
It's amazing how much time they took over that, isn't it? International conferences as well. They lasted for weeks sometimes, and thrashing things out at a time when traveling was hugely more difficult than it is today. Peter had his hand up earlier, and then it vanished again, but he's back now, so I'm going to take him next. Hi, Peter. Oh, can't hear you. It says you're unmuted, but I don't think you are. Or maybe you need to turn the volume up or something. Try now. No, can't hear you at all, unfortunately.
Is that now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Hi.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that before. Hi Ben, thanks for your talk. It's nice to to listen to someone that's just heavily involved in the research around this and doing the translations around the different programs. Specifically around that important time as well of the 1890s through to Lenin's period and the Bolsheviks. I've just got a quick question, and it's clear that you see a lot of good that was done with the Erfurt program, its minimum and maximum program, as you explained it, and I was just wondering, the other way we say all history is kind of present history, if it's to be useful anyway, and something to learn by. And you have sort of intimated in the talk that you do feel that there's elements of the Erfurt program in that particular organisation that could be applicable today. And I was just wanting to ask you how it might be applicable, what parts of it, the minimum, maximum, both, or one or the other. So just that's one question. The next question is, mentioned a couple of times, which is obviously crucial, democratic republic, and it was mentioned by another speaker before. And you mentioned Marx and Engels, and in particular, I think it was reference to Marx, when basically he was saying that we've now discovered, the secret of the organizational form of the democratic republic, and I'm wondering whether that's linked to the kind of aims of the Erfurt program as expressed through the fledgling SPD, or it differed entirely, because I don't think that come out. And I suppose that's my two questions. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. Do you want to answer that straight away, Ben, or should I take somebody else?
Yeah, I can do. I think just for if that's okay with everyone. I mean, I'll be quite brief. Yeah. So what's good or what's potentially usable or workable? I think it's the structure of the program in particular. It's also the idea that we need a program, that it's not something that you just kind of come up with one day. It needs to be informed by a whole body of theory and understanding of the world. That it's the nature of the program itself is that it's not a list of particular interpretations or ideas that one has to accept the program for what it is and work towards its aims, etc. I think that's all good stuff. And maybe I didn't explain the Democratic Republic question as well as I should have, but essentially the point would be that, again, if you look at Marx's writing on the Gotha program, he says, well, look, this idea of the free people's state is a nonsense. What we actually need is a different state form. And this is Luxemburg. This is not me reading Marx. This is me reading Rosa Luxemburg recently, and she says that Marx was so insistent upon the point that Engels raises about the culmination of the minimum program being the Democratic Republic, that he even said in terms of the Gotha program, it's not even worth having political demands if you aren't going to have what the culmination of those demands represents. Right? You might as well just get rid of them. It's a waste of time. So I think the structuring, the basic outline is important. Clearly, there's been a lot of history since then. A lot has changed, and I think generally the approach, I didn't talk about this, but generally the approach in the 19th century workers' movement was basically to take so you'd have the clear political section, so you'd have the political demands, right, that would outline. I talked about some of those. Then you'd have things like worker protection, insurance, taxation, things like that kind of lobbed on, and they were essentially just taken from the workers' movement at the time. We're in a different workers' movement at the time now. I think you need I think the economic approach of the Erfurt program will need to be rethought as well in terms of the demands that are raised, simply because of the history of the 20th century and social democracy and the way that economic reforms, many of those economic reforms have been achieved, but they've been achieved at the expense, if you like, of integrating the working class into the existing state form. Does that make sense? So it's not as if you can just go, hey, the Erfurt program and its demands are stick them here. Some are quite relevant, but fundamentally it's the approach, it's the structure, it's the ideas underlying the whole program in the first place, and the necessity of a party with a clear program that I think is informative, enduring, or whatever today. Does that make sense? It's the more the structure than the actual individual demands per se.
And he asked about the Democratic Republic.
I thought I dealt with that. So basically, the Democratic Republic is essentially it varies across time. But if you read Marx and Engels, again, I can recommend my book on this. Essentially, in Marx and Engels, it's synonymous with the rule of the working class, or the constitutional framework within which the working class rules. So, again, what I talk about in the Kautsky book is Engels makes the point that a truly democratic republican state was something along the lines of the Paris Commune. Why? Because you had the dissolved standing army, the armed people, etc., regular elections, recallability, etc. Engels missed out the workers' wage thing in his the workers' wage for all officials, as did Luxembourg, by the way. But that's the framework, which is outlined if you look closely at the political demands. So the first part of section 2 in the Erfurt program, and indeed the Heinfeld program, and indeed the RSDLP, those political demands, they provide the basis on which the working class will come to power. Democratic or republican democracy, right? Now, we've had other experiences of that since we had the Soviets, etc. But fundamentally, my point would be is that the form is subordinate to the content. It's the democratic republican content that's outlined in these programs that must be fundamental and guiding. So yeah, that's the democratic republic. It's the constitutional framework within which the working class will take power. And it finds immediate reflection in the political demands of the programs of social democracy.
Not just the absence of a monarch.
Yeah, exactly. So again, Engels's point is that, you know, there's nothing more monarchical than the French Third Republic, basically, because you just have a president that's hardly even elected anyway, that has all the power that the monarch once had, right? And that's true also in a sense of Weimar Germany. It was a more democratic constitution in a sense, but, you know, as things went on, the power of the president, presidential executive orders and things like that, that would be the point. Certainly, like America, France today, republics that, you know, are you know, presidential or, you know, semi-monarchical in the way that they can and do operate.
Yep. Ian.
Just a brief question. Good evening, comrades, and thank you very much, Ben, because that was an excellent presentation. I just wanted to ask about, because you mentioned the final adoption of the Erfurt programme, if I didn't mishear you, was unanimous. But was there not an organised opposition at all? Because quite clearly, and if there was an opposition, were they crusty old Lassallians, or was there already the beginnings of a developing revisionist movement within the SPD that was organising in opposition maybe to the Erfurt programme, or you know, just curious about the fractions that were taking place within the SPD?
Yeah, very good question. That's something I didn't, I planned to include, but didn't get round to. And that's the opposition. It's kind of a strange English translation because it's reminiscent of the 1980s comedy with Rick Mayall, but they were called the Young Ones, Die Jungen. And this was a group in Berlin, essentially, mainly in Berlin, of intellectuals and trade unionists that was essentially their main point was that they felt that the Erfurt program and its approach gave too much scope to what they called parliamentarism. Now, looking back, let me make clear from the outset that the opposition was a kind of semi-anarcho one. They were either left the party or were expelled, or some of them that actually became revisionist later on. Right? There's a good book that called German Marxism and the Intellectuals by Stanley Pearson. I mean, it's not a good book in terms of its intellectual framework because it's Cold War, but it does outline how the relationship between people like Paul Kampfmeyer in Berlin and what's the guy that produced the Max Schipper and you know, so people like that were kind of influenced by the left by this Die Jungen, the young ones left in Germany at the time, where they ended up. But I think where they had a point was that, you know, they were wary of the dominance of the Reichstag parliamentary group and its power. And again, that's something I'm working on at the moment in terms of 1905, when the party gives itself not a new program, but a new organizational statute. I'm doing this project kind of in the search of democratic centralism, right? And it does strike me that because the party, the Reichstag parliamentary faction, had so much power in the anti-socialist laws, that does carry over into how the party is shaped in its early years, right? But essentially, the opposition of Die Jungen came down to, well, we don't want to stand for parliament, we don't want to do that. What's far more important is direct action, trade union work, etc., etc. And it just fizzed and went nowhere. So it was only an anticipation of revisionism insofar as that impatience, if you like, or the disgruntlement with the kind of the longer term strategy that's outlined in the Erfurt program later saw some of them flip from being on the far left of the party to rejoin in it and being supporters of Bernstein, right? To say we need to get something done, we need to do positive work, we can't just be oppositionist, etc., etc. But yeah, those were the young, we could call them the young'uns, I suppose, and they were largely either expelled or they left after a heated debate and you know, quite a fractious run up as well. So that was going on parallel to these discussions. But in terms of the party, they had no, as far as I can see, they had no influence on the nature of the party program or its organizational statutes, because basically it was a kind of take it or leave it thing. But yeah, revisionism at that point really is kind of in its infancy. You do have, though, Georg von Vollmar's El Dorado speeches. El Dorado named after the Munich pub that he gave. He gave a series of speeches, which again, I've translated some of those on my website, where he basically starts to get this idea that now that we're no longer illegal, we don't have to be so fiercely anti-constitutional. if that makes sense. We can find a place within this Kaiserreich to create the best possible conditions and reforms for the working class. So the Jungen is kind of a little bit of a reaction to that as well, because Vollmar was very influential in the party. But that's really in 1891 at least, that's really the only signs of a kind of rightward trend, and Bernstein and people like that are not involved with that at that time.
Thank you. Okay, there's still a few people with their hands up. Gil, I think, was next.
Hi, Gil.
Oh, we can't hear you. I might have muted you.
Got it. Okay.
Sorry. Better. Yep.
Hi, Ben. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Gil.
I have 4 points. One, how tight is the connection between the minimum and maximum program? If there's one party, the connection's tight. If you gain power, you can implement your maximum program. But what happens if there are multiple parties? In Russia, there actually were at the beginning. How things happen in other countries, of course, there's never been a successful revolution as envisioned. But Marx says the democratic republic is where the class struggle will be carried out. And if there are multiple parties, the Marxist party, the Socialist Party, is going to have to fight to get its maximum program implemented. And so that's the question. How long does this transition period go? So just a conceptual point, and particularly in the United States, it's so big and there are so many different interests. I have a hard time seeing that the Workers' Party is going to take power and be the majority, and there won't be a problem of political fights. Okay, that's one point. The other thing, this is an old one that Lars Lee and Lenin rediscovered, and the content of the merger formula. Lee does not mention the Democratic Republic in Lenin Rediscovered. And so that raises the question of the political content of the merger formula. And we know Lenin's interpretation of the merger formula is you had to merge the working class to fight for the Democratic Republic. And it wasn't just in Russia. He said the same thing about France in regard to the Dreyfus case. So that's the content of the merger formula, which is an issue in the history of Marxism. The third point is what is to be done. There are two meanings of inside and outside in what is to be done. There's a difference between chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 2, when Lenin grabs Kautsky's quote, it's about science and bourgeois intellectuals developing the science and not workers. But in chapter 3, it's politics. Where does politics come from? And politics comes from outside the economic struggle. It's the total struggle of the society. And it's irrelevant who develops it. Workers, intellectuals, whatever. It's political people insisting on democracy rather than economism. And so that that's just another question of what is political consciousness? Is it just the science and the generality of the development of society, or is it actually the political struggle and the content of it? And the fourth point then is Plekhanov and the Emancipation of Labor Group program of 1887. Again, I mean, Lenin was familiar with Plekhanov and all of that literature before the Erfurt program was ever written. And so you're right that the question of a program was widely discussed. All the strategy, tactics, theory. And again, the Russian program was different there was no compromise about the Democratic Republic and universal and equal suffrage and overthrowing the czar, which I find much more consistent with Marx and Engels' clear statement of what the Democratic Republic is, compared to the fudging that the Germans, and I don't think you can characterize the weaknesses in the German expression as original sin. I mean, Engels gets it right. There's a weakness, and if it's not corrected, it will lead to bad consequences. And it did. So, okay, those are my 4 points. Great seeing you.
Good questions. Ben.
So just to come back to, cheers, Gil. Yeah, good points. I largely agree with you. I think the only thing I'd pick you up on is the connection between minimum and maximum program. Maybe we differ, or maybe it's just a slip of tongue. I think if you gain power, then clearly you're carrying out your minimum program, right? You're not carrying out the maximum program. Of course, the two are related, but the ideas the political structures you put in, they open up that transition, hopefully, right? But when the Bolsheviks come to power with the left SRs, they are clearly trying to implement their minimum program and struggling, right? Because there's all sorts of obstacles along the way. So yeah, it's not a straightforward thing, and there's obviously a dynamic tension between the two things, right? Because there's a temporal distinction, but there's also a political one, and so all I would say is that yes, in terms of the question of coalitions, etc., the point would then be: are you able to judge that you have majority support in the sense that what you can do is achievable, right? And which I think was the case in Russia 1917, particularly with left SR coalition support, right? So you've got that peasantry connection as well. And are you able to achieve enough of your minimum program to open up that transition that you want to see, and implement that? And I think that's the question. These are the difficult questions that will be made. And the idea that the SPD type idea was, okay, we will create, we will fight for reforms. As Luxembourg says, we will fight for universal equal suffrage for everyone with proportional representation. We will fight for the democratic republic, right? And we would on that level, if the bourgeoisie is willing to arm the people, right? Well, that's a good reform. We'll take it. Do you know what I mean? Right? That's if we're going to have armed, but the thing about the bourgeois state is it doesn't really do that. So what I'm saying is that it's not a schematic thing of like, oh, now we get to X point, we can now take power and do this. It could be that there are things along the way and all the rest. Do you know what I mean? So we're not being dogmatic about it, but I think the framework is the democratic republic, and are you able to carry out your minimum program, right? And I think we agree on that. I think it's just maybe a slip of the tongue, because that obviously opens up the transition. And the question of other parties is, again, one shouldn't be dogmatic about it, right? You would expect that in the society we live in now, where the working class is the overwhelming majority in most countries now across the world, that would create a different situation than, say, in Russia 1917. But one still has to be, to make concrete political judgments on the basis of, is this a strategic advance for the working class or not, right? And I think we agree on that. These are things you can't have ready-made answers to, and if you do, then you're not really thinking in politics, you're just thinking in dogma. Liam Lender discovered in the Democratic Republic. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the Republican aspect of Marxism is something that is really being treated very poorly. And I would say that there's, the reason I got into this stuff was when, was it one of the royal family people here, the older one, William, he got married. I was like, I need to look up Marxism and republicanism. What is there? And, I came across this Kautsky series, which really is kind of, it's not standalone, but in terms of the German SPD, there's very few longer treatises on republicanism, right? And I think that's something that Lars misses in terms of the question of political consciousness, etc. I absolutely agree with you, by the way, on the question of intellectuals, bourgeois intellectuals, inside, outside. It depends what you mean, doesn't it? Right. But it would just be fairly silly. You know, there are always exceptions. Like Dietzken was a worker, right? He was a very good popularizer of Marxism, a Marxist thinker in his own right. He, you know, his day job was a worker. He wasn't like a Marx who would just flounce around all day and, you know, read and write and work till 6 o'clock in the morning, reading some books, bookworming, etc. But the point is what is, you know, these ideas can come from all sorts of places. But all I would say is, if we want to arrive at a rounded political consciousness, right, which I think is, I take your point, it's not for us. I think changing the world is fundamentally about political consciousness in the first instance, right? But again, if you think about the SPD and what was some of the greater aspects of it, and I'm working at the moment, as you know, because on the Patreon, I'm working on Marxism and education. I'm working on Marxism and the family, right? So it's that political consciousness, but it is drawing on the best aspects of what you want to call bourgeois science or bourgeois intellectuals or bourgeois politicians, bourgeois Republicans, and trying to create our own voice and our own outlook on the world, right? So the inside-outside thing, I think, is just very unhelpful. But, and I think Lars is really good on this, it fed into a very silly debate then about the bend in the stick and all that in terms of Lenin, you know, this elitist versus, and it's just nonsense. Do you know what I mean? It's, as I say, it's literally Lenin picking up an article that should be with you in a few days, Gil, so you'll enjoy that. That's the Kautsky one. It's a very good article, actually. And the Emancipation Labour Group, I forgot to mention that program. It's important because, again, I think the benchmark here, or the point of reference, is the Parti Ouvrier program. And I might be wrong on that, but my impression is that in 1880, it's Marx and Engels and Lafargue, and that and the Gesdis kind of take up that, and that seemed to work, and it's got some traction. And I think, you know, Plekhanov spoke French, was, you know, I think he was in France a lot as well. I think, you know, there's all these kind of cross fertilizations and influences, and we've had this discussion before. I don't think while I agree with you that Engels was right and said this is an error, if it's not corrected, it can blow to all proportions. All I would say is I don't think that's the sole thing, or and I'm sure you'd agree with me. It's not like, you know what I mean? It's not the sole reason why the SPD ended up where it did. It was one symptom of a more general malaise, and Luxemburg picks up on that really well in 1910, in my opinion, and she shows the hypocrisy of Kautsky and others on this question, where, as I say, Kautsky was a leading authority on the Republican issue in 1905 at the International Congress in Amsterdam in 1904 against the French Republican socialists. And it's the more general thing of the what I mean by original sin is it doesn't all come back to this. But yes, clearly Engels was right on the fundamental thing, and that mistake was not openly corrected, but it was more clearly expressed in the Russian program, absolutely. But the structure and everything is here. You can go and look at them. The documents are informed by the same approach, and I think that's a powerful approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm pleased that Ben is making some moves towards a program. However, the whole thing seems to be that we don't need a program. We need two programs, two totally separate programs. In fact, a maximum program and a minimum program. And we got this at the Communist University as well, where people told us quite well, what we need to do is we need to start from what's necessary, from what we need, and not from what's possible. Well, I have an outrageous suggestion to make. What about linking what is possible with what is necessary? And to do that, you must put forward transitional demands. Now, this is not an idea that Trotsky came up with out of the top of his head in 1938. This was, in fact, the central theme of the Third Congress of the Comintern, the Communist International. This is what they discussed in great detail. Transitional demands to link what was necessary with what was possible. So you had reformist demands that workers put forward. You supported those demands in the sense that when workers won small demands, then this would give them the strength to fight for more. If getting little, then they'd ask for more. So the whole notion of the transitional demands was central to the Bolshevik Revolution itself. Of course, the maximum you put forward the maximum program, as you call it, in a revolutionary situation. But revolutionary situations are not situations that last all the time. They're very rare events in the class struggle. There was a revolutionary situation in October 1917, and putting forward the maximum demands for overthrowing the capitalist state and seizing power by the working class. That was the correct demand then. Nevertheless, they still retained some transitional demands. They still retained the Constituent Assembly until it exposed itself, eventually exposed itself by early 1918 as being part of the counter-revolution, and at that point it was suppressed correctly in favor of the rule of the Soviets. As for the Engels mistake, the Engels mistake back then was the mistake of the Red Republicans, and that mistake was very, very clearly repudiated as a consequence of the Paris Commune of 1871. In fact, the single correction to the Communist Manifesto is that exact point, that the capitalist state could not be taken over by the parties of the working class. The capitalist state had to be smashed. That was the only correction that they made to that Communist Manifesto. So now we have a situation where we have demands for a Republican Britain. The only point for the demand for a Republican Britain, because in order to make the revolution in Britain, it's going to be the same as making the revolution in France, or the same as making the revolution in state. You will have to overthrow that state. However, there is a progressive feature in demanding the abolition of the monarchy, because if you demand the abolition of the monarchy, you've got to demand the abolition of the House of Lords. And if you demand the abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords, then you're going to question immediately, well, where is the British Constitution? No, sorry, we don't have a constitution. Well, shouldn't we have a constitution now that we've abandoned the monarchy and the House of Lords? And of course, you'd have demands for constituent assemblies and all that sort of thing, which would raise fundamental questions about the nature of the state itself. Of course, the monarchy plays very little role in politics, but it could conceivably play a very repressive role if we had a police state, which is threatening by all those that legislation that the Tories are going at. The police state, and then the Privy Council would of course be one of those instruments, or maybe the central instrument in that type of a police state. But the division between the maximum program and the minimum program was, of course, the social democratic division. The minimum program was what you fought for right now, some Mickey Mouse reforms that you could get under the capitalist system, and the maximum program was socialism, and what you needed then was that to understand that socialism would come in its own good time, of its own volition, right? It would arrive objectively. So you had an objectivist maximum program, and it didn't really need such an outrageous thing as the storming of the Winter Palace and the abolition of the democracy for the bourgeoisie and their political parties. It didn't need any of that ridiculous dictatorship of the proletariat stuff. What we needed is extreme democracy of the bourgeois type, and that would bring us our socialism, which I really don't think anybody seriously believes anymore. Anyway, thank you for that.
You're muted, Tina.
Sorry. Thank you, Jerry. Ben, do you want to have a go?
Yes, I mean, there's a few questions of kind of like language and maybe misunderstandings, etc. But I would argue that a program has to determine, has to base itself on what is necessary, and yes, what is possible, right? What we can achieve, without kind of being utopian or whatever about it, right? And I think that the way in which Jerry it's a paradox, because on the one hand, Jerry attacks the SPD for Mickey Mouse reforms, minimum demands, such as the arming of the people, the abolition of the standing army, universal suffrage for everyone, which, by the way, led to one of the things that led to the collapse of the Kaiser state in 1918, right, including women. But then on the other hand says, well, look, so on the one hand, you've got this reformist fuddy-duddy program, so-called, but then on the other hand says, well, but you only really raise your, what he calls the maximum program, i.e. working class rule, I think he means by working class rule and socialism, in revolutionary times and periods, with the possible exception of the monarchy, because it opens up certain things. No, again, the idea that is somehow the experience of Bolshevism or the Russian Revolution is just, it beggars belief. I mean, because precisely what Gil and I were talking about in terms of the framework that the RSDLP program was fighting for, the abolition of the monarchy, the arming of the people, the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, the revolutionary peasantry, etc. Right? That's precisely what they did, not just in 1905, not just in 1917, but in the midst of the Stolypin reaction, in the midst of World War I. It's also true of what the SPD did, actually, right? It's not they're guiding revolutionary ideas for a new social form based on the minimum program, the culmination of its demands, was something you'd find in newspapers. People would go to jail for it, right? So they had this thing where if you were an editor of an SPD newspaper, they would deliberately choose young people who had no family or property or anything like that, because they would be constantly in and out of jail. And if they had money, their assets would be seized. So you have this real thing of local editors being constantly pulled in for making arguments like, yes, we should get rid of the 3-tier suffrage in Prussia, right? That was seen as treasonous, right? But that's not something, they didn't wait until 1910 when people were mobilizing around the question of democracy in Prussia to say, hey, do you know what? We got this program, and actually what we're for is for a completely new state. This is actually the point, paradoxically, that Luxembourg is making against Kautsky in 1910, right? Is that we are not raising our political program, the whole thing, not the Mickey Mouse reforms, but our whole political approach. We are not raising that at all times, and that's leading to a political rot and political confusion, not just amongst the working class, but amongst our own people, right? And I think that's the issue. You're quite right about transitional demands coming from, they actually come from Germany in the that's called the Socialist Republic. Well, look, again, it's about terminology, Jerry, right? But fundamentally, if you want to call it the Socialist Republic, call it the Socialist Republic. But the entire point of let's call it the Socialist Republic for the sake of argument. So let's put it to one side so we're speaking the same language, right? That is precisely what the SPD minimum program was about, and Engels criticizes that program for precisely not making that the point that this is actually the aim that we want, right? And that republic fits then nicely into, it's not two separate programs, it opens up the transition to the maximum program. That's the point. And again, so you talk about the failure of the red 1848ers. You should join my Patreon, Jerry, a couple of quid a month. You can have a look. Franz Mehring, I translated his article against Rosa Luxemburg, makes exactly the same point. He says, look, all this stuff about the Republic is a legacy of Marx's republicanism in 1848. and Luxembourg absolutely destroys him. She says, look, this idea that this republicanism is something for 1848 and a bygone, and now it's the socialist revolution and not some, it's just, it was a cover for, it was a leftist sounding argument, right, for Mehring's rightism, where he's defending Kautsky in 1910 in the pages of Die Neue Zeit, saying, what's all this stuff about the Republic? Don't you realize that Kautsky, that Marx got rid of his Republican superstitions, etc., right? You're right that the one major correction in the Communist Manifesto is the abolition of to smash the Staatsverbrechen, right? Which is a term that Lenin says is never found in German social democracy, but hey, we found it in some of Kautsky's writings. You're right to say that, but that's not a different approach to the one taken in Erfurt, in Heinfeld, and in Brussels in 1903, where the RSDLP finally agrees its program, right? So I think partly it's a question of language sometimes in the way that we speak to each other, but it's also a question of, I think, questioning one's own beliefs and looking at the material and thinking, oh, okay, that's quite interesting. What does that reveal about what we want to do?
Thank you. Raymond.
Yeah, republicanism goes way back in the history of the human race. At one time, the Romans had kings, then there was a republic, and they replaced that with an emperor. The French did exactly the same in the 18th century. And here in Britain, we were probably the first European power in the modern age to get rid of our monarchy and become a republican country for a brief period. I think it was 16 years. Then the monarchy came back. And I really believe that there's no such thing as permanency in politics. And that argument about republicanism and monarchy and how it's come and ebbed and flowed through time is a case in point. Arguing about democracy, let's put it in the balance. At the moment, it's probably the hardest battle to win in politics, the battle for democracy, because at no other time in human history have we been faced by such a powerful media in the hands of a tiny minority and actually global powerful capitalists that have never existed at the time of the Erfurt programme, Marx, Engels, and all the rest of it. And I really believe that Marxist idea, that once an idea has gripped the masses, it becomes a force for material change, will probably never exist in countries like Britain, France, and Germany, because that idea will not be allowed to grip the masses, and the mass media will work their damnedest to ensure it doesn't. And if the Corbyn project failure tells us anything, it tells us that power, even restricted to what? A couple of dozen news hats writing a weekly column in a newspaper, a couple of programmes every day on the television screen, some rumours started by his own bloody backbenchers, no armaments, no shooting, no mass strikes, some good mass meetings, demonstrations that achieved nothing. We're further back than we ever were in 2050. That's the power of our ruling class. That's the weakness of our democracy. And I'd like to ask Ben some questions in terms of the historic line, the minimum maximum programme. To my simple mind, a party's minimum programme would be the programme that allowed them to take office. They would win an election. The maximum programme would be the party's programme once they'd taken power, they'd consolidated a proletarian democracy, dictatorship, call it what you will. And I'd like you to try and trace that sort of these concepts through Gramsci's war of position and war of movement that I see as just the debate between tactics and strategy. And I would think a minimum programme is your tactics and your maximum programme is your strategy. So I'd like you to maybe remark on that historical lineage between the terminology, as well as the major points about the failure of Corbynism and where democracy is at the moment.
Interesting question. Thank you, Raymond. We have Only 6 minutes left. I suggest that we take Paul as the last speaker now as well, and then you can reply to both if that's okay. Hi, Paul.
Hi, thank you, Ben, for a very interesting talk, and I've learnt a lot tonight, and I've really enjoyed listening to your contributions and the contributions of other people. I've got a couple of questions. You mentioned the differences that exist between the method of used behind the Erfurt program and maybe the method that Trotsky used is in the transitional program. I wonder if you could say something more about that. And in particular, you touched on the differences that exist between the two programs. I just wondered if you thought there were any common elements there, both concerned with transition that's quite clear, from transition from capitalism to socialism. But I was just wondering if you might have some thoughts on that. And the second, I think, is we've been touching on this, and that is what would a program look like for a Marxist party with a mass working class membership? Would it look more like the Erfurt program, or more like Trotsky's program, or would there need to be some kind of superset of past programs that retain the rational and progressive elements of those programs and ditch the stuff that's no longer rational or no longer relevant? I mean, you mentioned, the difference there between Trotsky and other socialists about the emphasis he places on leadership rather than consciousness. It seems to me that obviously if you have leadership, you need the necessary conditions that are dialectically related, that leadership depends on consciousness and consciousness depends on leadership. So there's the two elements there. Anyway, I'll just leave those two questions. What are the, if any, other common elements between the Erfurt and Trotsky's program, and what would a program look like in the here and now?
Well, that sounds like a really good answer to a question to answer in the summing up as well. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Raymond. I think I'll start with Raymond. Maybe just chiming in on the point you made, would also maybe one distinction I think I need to bring out clearer, or maybe hadn't explained very well. Yeah, the global media moguls. I mean, don't underestimate, though, the influence of the media, of newspapers in Kaiserreich Germany. There was also newspaper cartelization. You had people, especially later on in Weimar. The Hugenberg press, was a huge enterprise right-wing outfit, and so it's not just now that we have a monopoly over media production and ownership. I agree with you that it's crazy now, but I think that's one of the things, in terms of lessons of Corbynism, to the extent that we can draw them, is it's something that the Erfurt program and the SPD got right, is that you need your own media, right? You can't, and it needs to be even in conditions of illegality, right? One of the things that kept the party together during the conditions of illegality was producing a newspaper in Switzerland and smuggle it in newspapers. That's one of the things that smuggle it in I'm getting tired. Smuggling it in suitcases. That's what Clara Zetkin did for a few years from Switzerland, right? It's the need for one's own independent media. And you look at the SPD. I don't know how much you know about the history, Raymond, but there's 100 daily publications, magazines for doctors, magazines for teachers, magazines for sports, magazines for children, et cetera, et cetera. There was a whole counter press, which I think that's the real indictment. I think one of the indictments of the left is how poor its press is, how unambitious it is, and largely unreadable as well. But it also this reliance. There is this idea now that we can rely on, YouTube or social or Twitter or something as that's the kind of way out of it, the kind of Paul Mason thing in the past. And no, we need our own YouTube, we need our own, social media platforms and all the rest of it. That's what we should aspire to, I think. And I think, I'm sure we agree on that, and I chime in. I agree with Jerry here in the chat, by the way. There is a difference between taking office and taking power. And that's worth underlining in terms of the context of these debates. The minimum program, its demands, those are the minimum that would be required for the SPD to take power. What exact form that would take is different, but it wouldn't just be coming into, like some French socialists argue for, wouldn't be forming a government within the framework of the French Third Republic, right? It would be actually coming to power and completely dissolving those institutions of rule. So I think there's a difference between taking office and taking power. And too often in the 20th century, the left has taken power, often in minority regimes, and basically been constricted by those existing power structures, either to then that they become adapted to it and become those institutions, or they're unable to do anything meaningful and are voted out the next time there are elections. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And I for all my disagreements with Jerry, I agree with him on that. There's a difference between taking office and taking power. On Paul's questions, the difference between the method of the Erfurt program and the Trotskyist program. Feeding off Jerry's point about the Third Congress of the Comintern, I think that, this again, I've spoken on this on several occasions in terms of the history of the Comintern, the German Communist Party. There are a lot of decisions made. The idea of the transitional demand that comes from Germany, right, is basically in a situation where you have a communist party that, for various reasons, is clearly marginalized and in a minority in the organized, conscious working class movement of Germany, huge movement, right? And it's trying to find ways in a very short-term manner of gaining leadership over the workers, for example, that would vote SPD. So there is this emphasis on, if we put forward demands, united front work, etc., we can show that we're the best fighters, we can win demands, and then the workers will often come towards us, and they'll want more as well, right? And that's informed by a healthy drive, but I think it's reflective of a Comintern that is actually in trouble, right? And that the Russian Revolution's in trouble. The German Communist Party is in all sorts of problems as well, right? And it doesn't fundamentally address the more fundamental point of working class revolutionary organization and party organization. So the minimum, the transitional demands are trying to address that lacuna in a kind of short-termist way. We're still trying to move on the German Revolution. We're trying to grow the Communist Party, and that's one of the ways we can do it, right? With Trotsky, it's a similar thing, but it's trying to win over workers that are been under the influence not only of social democracy but of Stalinism. And Jerry outlined it quite well, actually. It's the idea that if we focus on existing struggles that are, that were raging at the time, and Trotsky was of the view that the world bourgeoisie is, I think he puts it in the introduction, tobogganing towards doom and crisis, right? In that context, we can feed into those struggles. The masses will want more, and almost by the very nature of those struggles, they will come around to our point of view, and we will give them an alternative leadership, right? A revolutionary leadership as opposed to the sellouts of the SPD. And the social democracy and Stalinists, and clearly there's an element to that. But what I think is lost then, and has been lost, it's a very complicated process, and there are all different types of transitional programs, as Jerry would tell us. But essentially, what that has led to, in my opinion, is a kind of soft peddling of the fundamental tenets of alternative constitutional politics, high politics that characterize Marxism, right? Often with good intentions, but we've ended up with a situation where, you have someone like Jerry who will say, look, in Britain today, the monarchy is not that powerful. Okay, it's a good slogan, etc. But only in revolutionary situations do we put forward these bigger ideas, etc. And I would argue, and again, it's informed by that logic, right? Because when things speed up, right, in terms of revolution, in terms of struggles and strikes and all the rest of it, that's when, for Jerry and other Trotskyists, that's their time to come in with the right transitional demands that reflect the present and lead the revolution that way away from existing organization. But the problem with that is, and I would argue, history of the 20th century shows, particularly in Germany, that it's the absence of a revolutionary constitutional political alternative, that if it only gets put forward then in the midst of January 1919, in the death throes of a revolution, it's already bloody too late, and by a long way, right? So that I think is the point, is that sometimes these discussions seem esoteric and, you know, certainly with me, very historical and you know, centered on German speaking sources, etc. But it's about that idea that, you know, in order to become a mass organization with a following that is different from existing bourgeois parties, as Kautsky makes the point, you need a clear programmatic political alternative, which is often lacking for good reasons, right, that turn out to be wrong, in things like the transitional program, where these things tend to be played down. We do not start with existing struggles as revolutionary or whatever as they may be. We start with, where are we and what is our political alternative? And I think that is something that we can take, warts and all, from the Erfurt program, look back critically, but also understand what it was truly about. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's also, of course, about the working class taking all these issues seriously, because we want the working class to become the ruling class. If it doesn't know anything about, you know, how the monarchy works, if it doesn't develop that side of things, or, you know, how the House of Lords, etc., all these things. I mean, these are the questions that we want the working class to take on and take over, isn't it? So we have to not leave it for some time later, but for the here and now. It needs to become a developed political class that has an interest in everything, every single bloody issue here and now, and not just, you know, the wages and, you know, okay, nationalize this or that. That's not the answer, is it? We have to have a deep understanding of how capitalism works so that we can overthrow it. Thank you very much, Ben. Fantastic sessions, really good discussion as well. Thank you, comrades, for all your good questions and contributions. Ben, you must be knackered.
Yeah, just to say sorry if I haven't replied to all the chat stuff as well. I will save it, but you can, yeah, I put the slides. You can reach me if you want to write me questions, but I will try and have a look at it all. But it's quite tough when you're in the middle of it.
Very much so. Thank you very much, comrade. Next week, we're looking at democratic centralism, which will be another huge, important issue, with Kevin Bean, introduction by Kevin Bean. So he's looking at democratic centralism during the Social Democratic Party, late 19th century. And then this is something I'm really interested in, really looking forward to, is when we're coming to the end of this sub-series at the end of November, we're starting to look at the history of the Middle East, the history of Palestine, Israel, that situation, how it's developed since the Ottoman Empire, etc., and what we, you know, to understand actually what's going on, properly understand it, and what we can do about it, and where the solution lies, etc. Because it is complicated. It's not as complicated as some people make it out. You know, the bad sides, bad apples on both sides. No. But to understand the history of the oppression that's been going on for some time, it's really important to get to grips with it properly. So I'm looking forward to that. But I hope to see lots of you next week when Kevin Bean, as I said, will be starting to look at democratic centralism. Thank you very much, Ben, for an excellent session. Good night, comrades.